Our keynote speaker tonight is someone who embodies the very spirit of fearless and compassionate journalism. Kristof is a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner. He is also one of the most influential voices in global reporting. Through his decades at the New York Times and his relentless coverage of human rights abuses, global poverty, and humanitarian crises, he is not just informed, but has driven real change. As many of you know, when Nick is not traveling from global crisis to crisis, he spends much of his time tending to his family's farm in Oregon. We're grateful he has taken time away from that to be with us tonight. His work is a testament to the power of journalism as a force for good. His storytelling moves us, his advocacy challenges us, and his commitment to truth inspires us all. Please join me in welcoming Nick Kristof.
Thank you all. I'm really honored to be here. Some extraordinary winners tonight, and this is also a moment to celebrate the release of Evan Gershkovich since last year, and the work of AP in defending the rights of access for all of us. Having attended a number of these in the audience, I also know that the most important part of a keynote speech is not its eloquence, but its brevity. So in conclusion, okay, that was a joke. I want to also give a shout out to Lindsay Addario, who will shortly receive the President's Award. I've had the privilege of working with Lindsay in a number of countries, and you know, my first rule of staying safe in conflicts is you never get in a car with a photographer. You know, when a photographer hears gunfire, they immediately want to rush toward it. So it's great to admire photographers, to honor them, to give them awards, but you never want to trust them with your steering wheel. Now, these are truly some extraordinary times that we face, with challenges for journalism that are immense. We have real challenges for our business model, with 2.5 newspapers going out of business each week around the country. We have a crisis in trust for journalism. And then we have an administration that is moving in directions that in many ways remind me of authoritarian governments that I've covered around the world for decades. And we're divided ourselves within journalism about how to respond. How do we cover an administration like this? Do we use words like lie, or is that taking sides? Are we too prone to both sidesism, quoting one side and then the other? Are we engaged in sane washing, as some suggest? Or conversely, are we just a puddle of liberal elitism that doesn't understand the country that we're covering? So we face immense challenges and divisions, but let's also recognize that we've been given a responsibility of covering just a pivotal moment in history. Think of this as history giving us an incredible assignment, maybe the best and most important of our lives. And it's a test. This is, I think, a test of our courage, of our independence, of our integrity, and also of our ability at the same time to rebuild that business model and restore that trust. And I do think that this year we're rising to the occasion. And I've got to say, as somebody who, you know, early in my career used to file by telex, you know, which for the younger people in the room, so when I was covering the American Revolution, we used to, never mind. But as somebody who has been around for a while. I'm just awed, and I think that good journalism has never been better. And we face tremendous challenges, but I think that we can accept that audacious challenge and recognize that we should have an enormous sense of mission, a privilege to cover these times, for the stakes are high, and after all, this is why we enter journalism. So my views about covering authoritarianism were very much shaped by my years as a young reporter covering China and the Tiananmen Square movement, democracy movement. And I want to share with you some of the glimpses from that period. And in particular, when I moved to Beijing, we had to live in the New York Times official apartment, and we knew that it was bugged by state security, partly because one of our Chinese friends worked part-time translating conversations in our building. But we didn't know quite where the bugs were. And then a friend pointed to this little screened off kind of cubby hole as you entered the apartment, and he said, "That's where the bugs are." Well, I wanted to get to the bottom of this, so I got a ladder. I pried off the screen, and there was all this electronic gadgetry inside, and I was so proud of myself that I recognized the Chinese characters on the big gadget in front. And those Chinese characters read, "Electronic Sound Carrying Device." I was just, we've just arrived in Beijing. My Chinese is so brilliant that I've figured this all out. I've mastered this assignment. And my wife and I were very well prepared for this moment because we'd read a bunch of spy novels. And so we retreated to the bathroom and turned on the shower and whispered into each other's ears as we tried to resolve this. So what do? We figured we could leave the bugs in place, we could smash them, or we could leave them in place and use them as a disinformation channel to Chinese government. And so this is a smart crowd of professional journalists, so what would you guys do? I'm curious. So how many of you would take the well-behaved option? You would leave them in place. Raise your hand. Not a particularly well-behaved crowd, okay. How many of you would smash them? And how many of you would leave them in place but use them as a disinformation channel? I'm just going to take a few names down. The Chinese government pays me a little, and great minds think alike, because my wife and I had just arrived at that conclusion when at that moment a friend arrived at the front door and we found out what an electronic sound carrying device is in Chinese. It's a doorbell buzzer. But frankly, that was so useful. And it was a reminder that just when you think you've figured it all out, that you are the master of the universe, that you've nailed it, that's the moment to really beware and step back and take a pause. It's an incredibly useful lesson when you're a foreign correspondent in a different society. It's also, I think, a useful reminder at a time when politics in this country is so toxic and we're so divided. And a second lesson came soon after when we were covering the Tiananmen democracy movement. And frankly, I look back at that period with a certain amount of shame in the way I wrote some of it. And in particular, I often referred to the workers who were the backbone of the democracy movement. And I wrote somewhat condescendingly that they say they're for democracy, but they can't really define the kind of democracy that they want to create. They can't outline the guardrails or institutions that they would use to make it work. And that was all true. But that terrible night of June 3rd to 4th, 1989, when the troops moved in from all directions to Tiananmen Square to mow down the students, Some of the bravest people were these uneducated workers and peasants on, I'm sure many of you know the airport road going in from the airport to Beijing. Now it's a highway. Then it was just a two-lane road, and there was a salt-of-the-earth bus driver who was on that road. He'd heard that troops were coming in to crush the students, and then he saw a huge convoy of trucks filled with soldiers, and he hurriedly parked his bus across the road to block it, and he turned off the engine, and he took the keys in his hand, and he stepped out of the bus. The convoy had to grind to a halt. An officer got out of the lead truck and ordered him, "Move the bus." And the bus driver said no. And the officer pulled out his sidearm and repeated and said, "Move the bus." And this bus driver had the keys in his hand. It was night. He hurled the keys as far as he could into the high grass by the side of the road. Somebody like that might not have been able to define the democracy he wanted, but he was willing to die for it. And in recent years, it has struck me that some of those folks in Beijing, or people I covered in Arab Spring or other countries around the world, that precisely because they did not enjoy freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, precisely because they did not enjoy those rights, they understood even more than we do, perhaps, the value of them to a free society. And I've come to think that we can learn an awful lot from those folks who risked their lives for democracy, whether in Beijing or in Egypt and so many other places around the world. I think of a Chinese friend, Wu Xiaoyong, who was a senior executive of Radio Beijing English service that night. And he, when the troops were opening fire on the students, he quickly wrote out a script about the bloodshed and the massacre that was unfolding. And he gave it to the newsreader to read out. And troops quickly showed up at the radio station and wanted to arrest the newsreader. And Wu Xiaoyong said, "No, he's just reading what I gave him. I wrote that script. I take responsibility." And so ultimately, they arrested him. And he spent 2 years in detention. And I've often wondered whether in that kind of situation I would have the guts to take responsibility as he did. But we know that there are many journalists around the world, in countries from Russia to Turkey, Ethiopia, China, who face those questions, and they do take responsibility, and they do take these risks because they understand those stakes. And likewise, some of the prize winners tonight have faced enormous risks, whether in Gaza, in Syria, in Haiti, in Ukraine. And I think that their courage and commitment can inspire us all. If they can stand unflinchingly for these freedoms, then so can we all. And I'd also just like to make the point that the reason authoritarians try to crush journalists, and the reason authoritarians denounce journalists, is precisely because they recognize the importance of what we do. Their arrests they engage in, the denunciations, they are a measure of the importance of our work. They're a tribute to journalism, and we need to recognize that. Now, given the challenges in Washington and around the world, I think we're going to face plenty of ethical challenges, each of us, and they're going to be very hard to navigate. And they're going to be no obvious answers to some of them. My most challenging ethical dilemma is one that I think even many of my colleagues at the Times don't necessarily know about. Shortly after, when my wife and I covered the Tiananmen Square, the massacre and the crackdown afterward, there was a young man at Tsinghua University who had helped us cover them. And he had gotten into trouble because he had admitted us into the Tsinghua campus and registered us. And then afterward, he was secretly feeding us information about the crackdown. He was then arrested, he was imprisoned, and he escaped from prison and came to Beijing and asked me for help fleeing the country. What do you do? It's a pretty basic rule of being a foreign correspondent that you don't help escaped felons flee the country. On the other hand, here's a 19-year-old kid who had gotten into trouble only because he had helped New York Times readers and had helped us. And if we didn't help him, at some point he was going to get caught and pay a terrible price. And then compounding it all was, I'd never heard of somebody actually escaping from a Chinese prison. And I couldn't help wondering, could this all be some kind of a setup to try to catch us helping somebody? And what were our obligations to the New York Times? If we were caught helping him, the bureau might be closed, we could be arrested. And yet again, here's this 19-year-old kid. And I truly didn't know what to do. My wife's moral compass, fortunately, was better than mine. A lesson, always listen to your wife. And we did help him with as few fingerprints as we could possibly manage. He was able, with our help, to get to Hong Kong. I flew to Hong Kong the next day, and he's now in the US. And what's the lesson? I'm not entirely sure. I think there are few things that I've done that were so unprofessional, but few things that I'm prouder of. And the lesson can't be that we should be unprofessional or that we should break laws. But I do think that maybe one lesson is that our professional responsibilities have to be leavened in some form with a recognition of a larger social context, a recognition that the kind of journalism we practice in some way reflects moral choices. There are moral choices in what we cover, in who we quote, in the stories we profile, in the language we use. And this can be dangerous. One journalist's moral purpose can be another's megomaniacal crusade. But we will make mistakes, and we'll disagree about where that moral compass points. It always needs to be restrained by that sense of humility that you feel when you discover an electronic sound carrying device isn't what you think it is. But never doubt the importance of harnessing journalistic principles to something larger than ourselves. Now, we in journalism, we pretend to be cynics, but you scratch a cynical journalist and an idealist bleeds. Why do we go into journalism in the first place? It's not because of the family-friendly hours. It's not because of the pay. And I think it is because of some recognition, some belief that this is a public good, that we are serving a public interest in a larger sense. And I think that's what that Chinese bus driver recognized as well when he risked his life for a freer society. So courage. You all are doing incredibly important work. I said before that this is a test for our country, for all of us, and I truly believe that. And we've been tested before, and the truth is that sometimes we have been found wanting. And I think that one reason I've written a good deal about refugees over the years is because, having looked at how we've covered things in the past, I've seen profound failures of that test. In 1941, when the U.S. was barring most Jewish refugees from the US, including denying Anne Frank's family 3 times a visa to come to the US. The New York Times published on the front page an article raising questions about whether Jewish refugees, if admitted, might actually be Nazi saboteurs. It's heartbreaking to read this. I look back at how we covered the internment of Japanese Americans, and one of the first articles about it quoted Japanese Americans in a way that made it sound as if they were happy to be shipped off to these camps. And again, you just wonder how this could be. And of course, to our eternal shame, we and other organizations largely neglected the Holocaust. But there's also recognition of so many other tests in journalism that we passed with flying colors. What Edward R. Murrow and others did to take down Joe McCarthy, the Pentagon Papers, coverage of the Vietnam War, Watergate, Me Too. And this year, there's just so much extraordinary work coming out of Washington and elsewhere about what has been happening to green card holders and others, to USAID, to the courts, happening around the federal government. And the winners tonight, certainly a reflection of that courage and commitment to the sense that we are connected to a cause larger than ourselves. Now, I noted at the beginning that, there's profound disagreement in the journalism world about how we cover this moment in history, about what words to use, who to platform. There are generational divides as well, and I don't think they're easy answers necessarily. I do think that, in general, Marty Baron at the Wash Post had it just right when he said that we're not at war, we're at work. I'm an opinion journalist, but frankly, I think that some of the most important journalism is not the kind that involves shouting and waving fists, but rather the kind that involves shoe leather reporting that turns up new facts. Shouting at the end of the day doesn't necessarily change the world, but new information, even understated, truly does. That said, we can't pull punches. Our fidelity has to be utterly to the truth as we understand it. And we fail in that responsibility when we engage in both sidesism. We fail in that responsibility if we dispassionately observe our way to authoritarianism. And we shouldn't be neutral about upholding democracy. It feels overwhelming at times. I think we've all felt that. I've been so frustrated so often in my career covering genocide in Darfur, in Myanmar, or elsewhere, sex trafficking. You're just surrounded by so much pain, and it feels like you're not getting anywhere, not having that impact. AIDS wiping out villages in southern Africa. But I've also seen how we can make imperfect progress against these kinds of scourges. In journalism, we tackle injustice. We tackle dictators with these fragile tools we carry, our reporters' notebooks and our cameras. And they are tools as powerful as they are fragile. You know where these reporter notebooks come from? Do you know the backstory of them? They used to be called Claude Sitton notebooks. And that's after the legendary civil rights reporter for the New York Times back in the early 1960s. Now, back at that time, the journalists typically carried these stenographer notebooks when they covered the Freedom Riders and civil rights demonstrations. But everybody could thus recognize that they were journalists, and Klansmen would set upon them and beat them and club them. The great civil rights leader, John Lewis, said that the racist mobs would first target the journalists and incapacitate them, and then go after the civil rights leaders. So Claude Sitton went to a stationery store and he asked the stationery store to take the stenographer notebooks and cut them in half to produce a notebook that he could hide in his jacket pocket. And he then bought a case of them, and he distributed them to other civil rights reporters on the front line. And so today we have reporters' notebooks. Now, Claude Siddon wasn't partisan. He wasn't a crusader. He didn't shout. He wasn't in the tank for anyone, and he didn't tone down stories to match some preconceived narrative. His devotion was absolutely to the truth. But he did have a larger concern for context, for justice, and he refused to be a loudspeaker for racists trying to manipulate the public. So today, those racist politicians like George Wallace and Bull Connor are gone, and we were around to write their obituaries. Today, our own generation of journalists faces a similar test, and we have new tools that are a lot more complicated than reporters' notebooks. But if we stick to our principles, if we're not at war but at work, if we follow our compass as best we can, if we're humble enough to acknowledge all our imperfections, that we get it wrong regularly, if we acknowledge all that, then we will get through this. This is a historic opportunity that fate has given us. It's a privilege to cover this country at a potential turning point in its history when the stakes are so great. And decades from now, in some future crisis, an OPC speaker will inspire our grandchildren with tales of the fortitude that journalists like tonight's prize winners displayed in the 2020s. Thank you all very much.